Welcome to the Fuel Pulse Show podcast. I'm your host, Erik Bjornstad. I'm your guide through the ever-changing world of fuel. So here at the podcast, we talk about all things related to all the different kinds of fuel that you use, both at work in a professional capacity and at home for personal use. And then in addition to that, we also talk about all the things that use that fuel. Again, both at work and at home. That means the Fuel Pulse Show podcast is really for everybody. What are we going to talk about today? Last time we were together, we introduced a scenario where you at your job might have a backup generator system, maybe an emergency generator system, and it runs on stored diesel fuel. And your generator system shuts down. It won't start, perhaps. That's a no start situation. Or it starts, but when you try to bring it up and maintain load, it will shut down. Something is wrong. It has a no run situation. Something's not right with it. The generator service technician looks things over and declares a solution. Your fuel is the problem. Your fuel is bad. Maybe it's even so bad that it wrecked some important components of your system, and those are going to have to be replaced. Sounds pretty serious, doesn't it? We floated the idea last time that there are things that you can do from a diagnostic standpoint that can end up saving you a lot of headaches by making sure before you commit to spending thousands on replacing things, making sure that the solution isn't actually a relatively simple mechanical fix, like fixing a stuck check valve or replacing the primary fuel filter. And we said that for a business like yours, a no start or a no-run condition for the generator is a pretty serious matter. But the answer to why it's not happening is you just have to know the right approach to take. You have to know the right answers to the right question to ask, right? And it is important to take the right approach to finding out the true answer to your problem instead of relying on assumptions that might prove to be wrong, many times could prove to be wrong. See, most of the generator service technicians, and you don't really think about this, but this is absolutely true. Most of the generator service technicians, they know a lot about generators. They do not know that much about fuel. Most of them that conclude that the condition has to be due to a fuel problem, they don't really know enough to say that for sure, to make that diagnosis for sure. But they will blame the fuel anyway because it is the easiest thing to do. You make something else the culprit. And so what we want to talk about in this episode, this part 2 episode, is we want to shift our focus, having already gone through the mechanical things. Now we want to shift our focus to the fuel itself, to what that technician may have originally blamed for your problem. Now, if you followed the steps that we outlined previously, you examined some of the fuel system elements that are commonly overlooked when diagnosing operational problems. And you also addressed whether microbial contamination might be a contributing factor. Now, if you haven't gotten a satisfactory answer to your problem by now, this is when you want to put that fuel is bad diagnosis to the test. But that doesn't mean dumping the fuel quite yet, because we still don't know if that diagnosis is actually right. And so before committing to such a solution that's going to cost us thousands of dollars, we have a little more due diligence to do. As I said, generator service technicians are not fuel experts. So it's easy, even for professionals like them, to misunderstand the role that bad fuel can or cannot play in a no-run, no-start situation. It is a real temptation to use the fuel as a fallback culprit when the technician's unable to find the real problem. Many cases, when they conclude that the foundation of the problem, the cause of the problem is that the fuel's bad, they cannot actually explain how the fuel's bad. They cannot explain why its suspected subpar condition is causing the overall problem. They just make this general blanket diagnosis. And that's a problem. The question is, okay, for fuel, what kinds of problems can out-of-spec fuel cause? Okay, because if the fuel actually does have a problem, there will be problems that it can contribute to, and it's helpful to know a little bit more about that. Let's start out. If the fuel that you have doesn't have the proper combustion characteristics, meaning its flashpoint could be too high or too low. Its distillation curve could be off significantly, not slightly, but significantly. If its cetane rating is too low, the engine might have trouble starting, or the engine might have trouble maintaining load while it's trying to use that fuel. If the fuel's basic viscosity has been compromised for some reason, that can have an effect on how the fuel is metered by the injectors. All of those things do sound like something significant. Now, another thing that's sometimes looked at is if the fuel's lubricity rating is catastrophically low, not just marginally, but significantly, that can cause damage to fuel pumps and injectors. However, the thing to keep in mind, having said that, the thing to keep in mind is that it's pretty rare these days to find diesel fuel that had such a low lubricity rating that it causes catastrophic damage. And that's because almost all diesel fuel available today contains a small amount of biodiesel. And that actually fixes any existing lubricity deficit that it had when it came out of the refinery. Still, theoretically, your fuel's lubricity rating could matter in this context, and so that's why we measure it. Okay, another problem. What about beyond combustion characteristics? What about contaminants? What about if there's excess particulate that's in that fuel? So much excess particulate then leads to filter compromise. In that kind of situation, you could theoretically have fuel that contains so much particulate, so much sediment, that the fuel filters get plugged in their effort to keep contaminants from reaching critical engine parts. In that kind of situation, the filter wasn't damaged, wasn't eaten up, so to speak. It simply reached its load-bearing capacity, and it needs to be changed. And until it is changed, there would be a possibility that excess particulate might get past it and reach places that it's not supposed to. And we all know that's not a good thing. Those are some of the basic fuel characteristics that, if they're off by enough, they could, in theory, contribute to a problem in your system. But when a generator technician, who, keep in mind, is not a fuel expert, when a generator technician blames the fuel, they are very likely not thinking about those specific things. What are they thinking about? We would ask, what are the kinds of things that the fuel might falsely be accused of causing? For one, let's talk about filter damage. There's a real world situation that I came across where there was a municipality in the area here in Florida, and they had multiple generators. Let's say they had 20 or more, and a bunch of generators. And out of that pool of 20 plus generators, they have 4 of them that are all the same type of generator, same manufacturer, but different from the rest. In other words, they don't have 20 generators made by the same people. They have 16 that are made by one manufacturer, and then they have these 4 that are made by another one. These 4 is where they were having problems. What they were seeing was that they kept having injector pumps going bad in all 4 of those. And because of the age of those generators, this was a warranty situation. So the generator service company sends a technician out to them, looks into the situation. What do you think the service technician concluded? They concluded that the fuel was bad. The fuel was to blame for their problem. And furthermore, they doubled down in odd specifics in this. They claimed that what was happening with the fuel was that the fuel was eating up the filters. That's exact words from the technician's diagnosis. The fuel that was supplying these generators was eating up the filters, which then was leading to continual damage to the fuel injection pump, leading to them having to be replaced at the cost of thousands of dollars, of course, because they're not going to honor the warranty because it's not their fault, right? It's the fuel. So that's the situation. That was the situation. It's probably not that atypical from situations that other people have had as well. The more you know about the fuel, the more you know about fuel in general, the easier it is to see that this kind of claim by the technician in this particular matter just is not supportable by the facts found in the real world. Now, here's several reasons why we can say that. For one, fuel filters tend to use cellulose paper filter mediums for a couple of reasons. First of all, because they work pretty well, so they're good enough to do the job well. But also second, because cellulose paper isn't something that's really susceptible to damage from chemicals. It's a pretty inert material. It's pretty impervious to damage from chemicals in the fuel. Additized fuel simply does not contain anything within itself that would be expected to eat up paper filter medium in the way that this technician was describing. Okay, so you present that real-world fact situation, and the tech counters. He says, you don't have unadditized diesel fuel. You put stuff into that fuel. You treat with biocide and you treat with stabilizer. It's the biocide and the stabilizer that's damaging and eating up these filters. That's what did it. Okay, except that explanation doesn't correspond with reality either. See, all fuel treatments, whether they're biocides, whether they are injector detergents or detergent packages, fuel stabilizers like oxidation retardants, cetane improvers, other things, all fuel treatments that are going into on-road fuel have to be registered with the EPA. Now, realize that generator fuel isn't on-road fuel, but many times there's crossovers with that. They'll use the same type. And many times the types of fuel treatments that are used in on-road fuel are also used in off-road fuel because there's no reason for them not to. We can basically say all types of fuel treatments that are going into the fuel that's likely going to be in your generator system or in their generator system in this situation, they have to be registered with the EPA and they have to have their formulation disclosed. And the EPA can tell from the formulas whether those treatments contain anything that might cause damage to not just the engine components, but things associated with the engines like those filters. That means as long as you're using a properly registered fuel additive, not something that somebody cooked up in their garage, but something that is legally registered with the EPA, as long as you're doing that, the idea that fuel additive is causing the fuel to eat up the filters or damage the filters in the way that this technician claims, that simply does not correspond to reality. And it's very likely that the technician, in saying what he's saying, doesn't actually know any of this. So, before you commit to dumping thousands of dollars worth of stored fuel over technician's hunch like this, you need to take some diagnostic steps to confirm whether the fuel actually is bad and is causing the problems that they think it is. So, what does this mean? This means fuel testing, which might seem like overkill. It's definitely not in this kind of situation, because remember, this is a situation where you're facing thousands of dollars being at stake at a minimum. Could be multiple tens of thousands of dollars being at stake, depending on how long the problem might go on if you pick the wrong solution to chase. Like it or not, you're going to need to do some fuel testing if you haven't found the solution up to this point. Now, most of this fuel testing that we're talking about is done at a third-party laboratory. Now, you stop there, that starts to scare some people, and it starts to scare some people because, not because they're opposed to that kind of thing in principle, but because they don't really know how to get it done. We're going to tell you how to get it done. From a best practice standpoint, when we say fuel testing in this context, we're talking about taking a fuel sample out of the tank in question and then sending it off to a lab to be tested, where the results will be able to tell us something meaningful about the fuel's condition with respect to whether it is actually likely contributing to this problem or not. Now, there are hundreds, literally hundreds of kinds of fuel tests that can be run in a lab, but many of them won't actually tell you what you need to know in this specific situation. We're going to tell you the ones that do tell you something that you need to know. If the question at hand is whether the fuel's condition is preventing that generator from starting or preventing it from maintaining load, that's going to be confirmed by documenting either its combustion properties or whether it has any contaminants in it. Combustion properties, tests that shed light on those, are the ones like flashpoint, distillation value, cetane rating. Those ones that we mentioned earlier. Now, if the question is, or the accusation, if you want to put it that way, is whether the fuel or something in the fuel is damaging filters, such that system components normally protected by those filters are being compromised, like what was the accusation in this particular example we gave, then the tests that you're going to want are going to be the tests that measure contamination or levels of contamination in that fuel. Some of those are water by Carl Fisher, the water and sediment content test. There's also one called an ISO particulate count test. That can be useful for documenting the specific particulate content, which means how much of particular size of particles there in the fuel. For example, in the situation that we described earlier, where excess particulate matter from the fuel was thought to compromise the fuel filter, you could run an ISO test alongside, let's say, a water and sediment test, and those two results together would tell you probably everything you need to know about whether the problem was being caused by the fuel or not. Those are some of the tests that you'd want to have run. Many labs will offer test slates, groups of tests, to have all the important ones together at essentially at a discounted price, right? Because it's more cost effective for them to do a bunch of tests together as opposed to charging out each one individually. Now, one thing to remember though, a big truth that one should always take into account when you're doing any kind of fuel testing is only as good as the sample being tested. You want to make sure that your test has what they call the highest diagnostic value possible. That means that you're going to need to keep a couple of things in mind while you're getting the fuel sample that you're going to be running that test on. Thing number one, first, the issue of where or how deep in the tank you should pull your sample from. That's important. We're going to explain why. Most generator fuel supply tanks, they have the fuel pickup lines are positioned about 3 to 4 inches off the bottom of the tank. Most cases, if that tank has water in it, many of them do, it has water, that has sediment that has developed over time, it has emulsified fuel, which can develop over time. In most cases, all of that's going to be located below the pickup line. Because if you think about it, if you've got more than 3 or 4 inches of that kind of stuff at the bottom, you've got a lot and you probably need to do something. So in most cases, all that water and particulate contaminant stuff is already located below the pickup line. And that means it's not going to be drawn into the engine system by that pickup line. It's not going to be causing a direct problem. It's just sitting there. Most fuel storage tanks have at least some amount of this. If you don't disturb that, then in most cases, it's not going to create any filter plugging issues. Or a better way to put it, if you don't disturb that, it's not going to be something that's going to be causing a problem for you. The reason why we bring this up relates to that question of where, how deep to sample from. Because if you take a sample from the very bottom of the tank, what they call the dead bottom of the tank, what are you likely to get in that sample? You're likely to get a sample that's going to pull in a whole bunch of that water and that particulate. And that lab does not distinguish between what they see in that sample. If they are given a sample that is 50% water, they're not going to kick this back and say, hey, this is 50% water. You sure you want to do this? No. Their job is to run whatever test you contract with them on the sample that you give them. Problem is that if you give them a sample that's full of this contamination, you're going to get results that don't actually reflect the true condition of your tank. You're going to get results that fail in the contaminant department. And that's a problem because in reality, your fuel does not have that much contaminant in it. You just happen to have pulled a sample that, as they say, was not diagnostically useful. How to get around this problem? Most fuel testing labs, they know that this is true, and they recommend then that fuel samples be taken not from dead bottom, but between 3 to 6 inches off the bottom of the tank. And that's generally a good practice. And so that is going to be the first thing you're going to want to keep in mind when you're pulling a fuel sample. Now, second question that comes is, how do you pull fuel samples? How do you retrieve samples like this? Okay, so to avoid disturbing the particulate and contaminating your sample, you need to have the proper sampling equipment. The best practice thing that is used within the petroleum industry for sampling like this is what's called a fuel sampler. It's also known in the industry colloquially as a bacon bomb. It's a long cylindrical tube, usually made of non-sparking material, and you lower it down by a line to whatever depth you want, whether it is 3 inches from the bottom, 6 inches, maybe you want to do one up top. You can control how deep you take your sample. It's going to pull a sample into itself. You bring it back up, you decant your sample into a sample container, and there you go. If you manage stored fuel, you definitely need to have a bacon bomb fuel sampler available to you because you're going to need to do fuel sampling. So you need a bacon bomb. You can get them from different companies. Bell Performance has one that comes with extensions that actually enable you to control the depth that you take your sample in off the bottom. So that's relatively convenient to use. And if you're unfamiliar with how to use a bacon bomb, we can actually give you some guidance on how to do that, because it is important to know how to take good fuel samples if you're going to get a good answer to this question. Once you retrieve your fuel samples, before you send them off to the labs, is there anything useful that you can tell about them simply by looking at them? That's an interesting question. A good rule of thumb to follow is that when you're decanting samples, put them in a clear glass jar. Now, the reason I want to do that is because you can immediately look at them and you can tell what they look like. And what you're looking for is you want to see if those samples are what they call clear and bright. You've seen clear and bright fuel. You can see through it. Doesn't look like there's any cloudiness, no haze, nothing that's not supposed to be in there floating around. It looks like clear, clean, bright fuel. If your fuel sample is clear and bright, you can see through it, then the fuel most likely does not contain a whole bunch of excess particulate that's going to cause a problem on the contamination side. Now, that doesn't mean that its combustion properties might not be off. You cannot tell from looking if a diesel fuel sample has a flashpoint that's off. You can't tell by looking if its cetane rating is too low. So you're still going to need to test, but you can get a good general idea of whether on the contaminant side, that fuel sample is going to be problematic simply by looking at it. Now, too many times, someone will pull a fuel sample, looks visually clear, and then someone else will look at it and say, we still need to polish that fuel anyway. Fuel polishing, as you may recall, means fuel filtration. Typically, if a fuel sample looks clear and bright like that, you don't need to do fuel polishing, because if there's nothing in the fuel as far as contaminant that can be filtered out, then fuel filtration and fuel polishing isn't likely going to have that much benefit for that fuel. Circling back to what I said a moment ago, if you have a sample that looks visually clear, I did say, remember, that doesn't mean the combustion properties are what they should be. Combustion properties are something that you cannot get a sense of just by looking at the fuel. And the reason I bring that up is because there is something very common, or I should say surprisingly common, that happens in diesel fuel tanks. And that is if diesel fuel has been contaminated by gasoline. This happens much more often than you would think. You've got fuel suppliers, they're switch loading, they're using the same trucks to haul different kinds of fuel. It happens. Gasoline gets into the diesel fuel. It doesn't happen intentionally. Nobody expects it, but it does happen. And gasoline contamination in diesel fuel is bad news for several reasons. Number one, diesel components in common rail diesel engines, they rely on things like the lubricating qualities of that diesel fuel, the lubricity. Gasoline has virtually no lubricating property. It doesn't have to have them. And if you introduce a small amount of gasoline, that can skew the lubricity rating of that fuel and contribute to the kind of damage that we had mentioned earlier. Another thing that does it skews the flashpoint dramatically. Doesn't take a whole lot of gasoline to depress the flashpoint of that diesel fuel from 125 degrees, I think is typical flashpoint for number 2, down to, remember, gasoline has a flashpoint of -40. So just think mathematically, would not take very much at all to lower that down enough to where the engine starts performing abnormally, shall we say. If you submit that kind of fuel for testing, gasoline contamination very likely would show up in at least the flashpoint test and the distillation test, if not some other things. Okay, if you do happen to find that your diesel fuel is contaminated by gasoline, that's a situation where you are going to need to replace that contaminated fuel with fresh diesel fuel. All right, let's start to bring this home here. If there are numerous different tests that can tell you something useful about your fuel, how do you know which ones to choose to help solve your problem or guide you towards a solution, right? After all, you can test yourself into the ground, as they say, and that's not really something anybody really wants to do. But you also don't want to miss the opportunity that you have to have the best chance of finding the right answer to your problem. So for this best chance, you're going to get the best results by running what they call an ASTM mission critical test slate. Now, as we said earlier, many labs will offer groups of tests together in a test slate, and they may call it something similar to this. ASTM mission critical is what we internally call our recommended group. This kind of slate, it groups together the most important tests from that D975 specification. The tests that define combustion characteristics and the fuel tests that document contamination levels. That kind of test slate is probably a good one to consider first. Now, if you're not sure if that group of tests offered by a particular lab will tell you everything you need to know, you can do a couple of things here. You have a choice of a couple of things. The labs themselves are always willing to advise on customer questions. If you explain what you're looking for, explain what your problem is, what you're hoping to accomplish, they are really good. Labs today are really good directing you to the kind of testing that you're going to need that's actually going to give you the answers that will be useful to you, while also keeping you away from doing tests that aren't going to be useful to you. Labs do that kind of thing all the time. Don't hesitate to ask for a lab consultation to explain what you're looking for. They are more than happy to do that for you. You can do that. Other thing you can do is you can consult with an outside fuel expert who can give you more direct guidance for your situation. Groups like that, Bell Performance does that. You don't have to come to us. You can go to somebody else. Whether you talk to a lab or you talk to an outside fuel expert, there are plenty of people who are willing to give you good direction and good information to help you solve the problem that you have. Your best answer is out there somewhere, even if you need a little help knowing where to look, right? Okay, so to this point, we know which tests are going to shed the most light on whether our fuel really is contributing to our problem, but we still have to ask, once you get those test results back, what do they mean, right? The most important thing, if you run an ASTM mission critical test slate, the most important thing that's going to confirm to you is if all of the tests, I think there's probably 8 or 9 different tests, they all come back in spec, then that means your fuel's normal. Your fuel meets the minimum requirements in all of the areas that have been determined by the industry to have to do with supporting the minimum operating functions of your engine and your generator and not contributing to component damage. So if you get a passing grade on all those, that should be enough for you to cross off the fuel as a causative factor as to why your system still isn't running. That means you're going to save thousands of dollars. You're going to get saved from spending thousands upon thousands of dollars getting rid of and replacing fuel that actually didn't need to be replaced in the first place. What if one or more of the fuel results comes back abnormal, out of line? Now you're required, very important piece of information. Depending on what those test results are, depending on how far out of line they are, now you have some specific pieces of information that can help guide you as to what specifically you need to do. Because the answer is not always going to be the same. If your flashpoint's off, that's going to mean something different than if your water and sediment is off. Again, having the test results will give you the information you need to know to be able to make that decision. So whatever happens, doing this kind of fuel testing, you're going to have gone from relying on guesswork as to what your solution should be to being able to have a much more definitive answer. And anyone who works with systems like the kind that we're talking about, they know that there is tremendous value in having the ability to be confident in that kind of information. Okay, last thing. Let's say your fuel test results come back clean. Great. You've already run through all the mechanical diagnostics that we talked about earlier. They all checked out, but your system still will not run. You still got that problem. Now would be the time, if all that's true, now's the time to take what you know and consult with a mechanical expert who can give you guidance on what to do next. Because everything that we talked about, they're all general guidelines. They cover as much as they can about all the different kinds of systems out there. But we know that there are lots of differences in lots of different systems. Every system is just a little bit different. If you haven't been able to find a problem up to now, the best thing that you can do is talk with somebody who is a mechanical expert who can look at your system, take what you already know in these important areas and say, okay, let's try this other thing. And you can start making more meaningful progress down the road for you. The important thing, though, is that if you've done everything up to this point, you will have crossed off a bunch of the most commonly cited culprits, along with eliminating one of the most common things that often gets incorrectly blamed for a problem and sends users off on wild goose chases that cost a lot of money and don't end up well because they haven't correctly identified the problem cause. Now you're in a much better position to be able to fix what needs to be fixed. If you're in the inevitable position of dealing with a no start, no run situation, you know it's pretty important to get to the bottom of what's causing that, right? Hopefully by now you have a little clearer path, a little clearer idea of the direction that you need to take to solve your problem and get things back where they need to be, right? Just saying one last thing about this whole consulting with a mechanical expert, if you haven't found the answer. This whole thing we're talking about, dealing with fuel, dealing with generator issues, that can be a daunting task, especially if you're not an expert in those areas, if you're not a fuel expert. It can be intimidating. This kind of consulting is something that Bell Performance actually does. If you need to reach out to us, we certainly would welcome the chance to help you solve your problem. But it doesn't mean you have to use us. If you find yourself in this situation, just reach out to somebody who is knowledgeable, somebody who's an expert, somebody who you're confident that is going to have your best interests in mind. Reach out to somebody who can help you. You are an expert in your area. They are experts in the fuel and the mechanical factors. It is always a good idea to take advantage of subject matter expertise, especially when, to be honest, you got so much at stake here, right? And with that's going to do it for this episode of the Fuel Pulse Show podcast. If you like what you heard, you haven't subscribed already, then feel free to subscribe at your podcast purveyor of choice. It could be Google Podcasts, Amazon Podcasts, iTunes, Stitcher, whichever ones you use. Leave a review, positive review if you can. That helps us a lot. As always, we typically have links to some of the things we talked about in the show notes, so you will find those there as well. So until next time, I am Erik Bjornstad, your guide to the ever-changing world of fuel, and I will see you next time for the next episode of the Fuel Pulse Show podcast.